I'm going to talk about Japanese maples a little bit. We love Japanese maples here. They're the symbol of the Arboretum. We kind of have an informal policy that anywhere you are in the Arboretum, you should be able to see a Japanese maple. And when we talk about Japanese maples, there's a broad way to talk about it and kind of a more restrained way. Typically, when you say Japanese maple, you're talking about Acer palmatum, a plant that's native to Japan and parts of Korea and China. More broadly, people also typically include Acer japonicum, Acer shirasuanum, maybe Acer sibolianum, and Acer pseudosibolianum. There are a few more plants that are in the Japanese maple section, the palmata section. But our symbol for the Arboretum is the Japanese maple leaf. And I think Arlene came up with this topic for this talk because somebody did the math and they say, this is my 45th midweek talk since we started doing this last year. And so this is our 45th anniversary. So I'm going to talk about some Japanese maples. 45 for 45, I said. I did not actually count. So nobody count will say we're talking about 45 Japanese maples. You know, they're kind of interesting in kind of their place in gardening, in, kind of people's minds. They were for years, they were kind of the really elite of the elite plants. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that they had to be grafted, and there weren't a lot of people who did grafting. And most of the people who did were on the West Coast, if you're talking about here in the US. And so plants had to be shipped from the West Coast. That was when there was less shipping of plants that far. So anything that you had that was grafted and then had to be sent cross country tended to be pretty expensive. And so Japanese maples kind of became kind of a fairly elite type plant. When you couple that with kind of, people often spend a lot of time pruning them and really, putting them in prized locations. They were kind of something that a lot of gardeners aspired to, having Japanese maples. Times have changed, and now they're very, very available. We've got one of the best Japanese maple nurseries in the country, really getting a lot of these unusual Japanese maples out in Mr. Maple. You might know Matt and Tim Nichols of Mr. Maple up in the mountains. They're doing some amazing stuff and getting these plants out. But they've always kind of held this real special spot. We know from literature in Japan back at like 600 CE, that they were already growing them. And early, more than 1,000 years ago, you could find references to several dozen different Japanese maples in the literature in Japan. By the 1700s, there were hundreds of them, and now who knows, maybe thousands. They tend to be pretty easy to grow. Sometimes they have a reputation for being tricky, but really they are understory trees. So in the wild, you can kind of see from this picture in Japan, they're growing amidst other plants, but usually under some other plants. So they will tolerate quite a bit of shade. In cooler climates, they like a lot more sun. For us, some are great in full sun. A lot of the variegated ones, and I'll talk about some of these, really need a bit more shade and are a bit happier in some shade. The selection on them has just been amazing. So there's literally thousands of them out there now. In Japan, in the fall, people go out maple hunting to go take pictures of maples in the mountains. They call it momiji garu. Momiji refers to maples, and specifically Japanese maples, typically. Kaidi is another word you sometimes see in Japan. That's just kind of in maples in general. But they're kind of perfect for any location. You got ones for sun, for shade. There are little dwarf ones that are like shrubs. There are ones that are almost like ground covers. There are fairly vigorous ones that'll grow to 30 or more feet tall. They tend to do well in containers. They make great bonsai plants. really, as long as you're giving them a cool period for them to go dormant, they'll grow just about anywhere. So really pretty exciting group. And we're in just a golden age of Japanese maples. People are doing so much work with them right now. Remind me at the end, and I'll talk about some problems and diseases and insects and things that can affect them. But right now, we'll kind of jump into Japanese maples. It was a real highlight to be in Japan during the fall and go through the mountains and see these. And people really did. You'd have cars stopped on the side of roads and people out with these big, huge cameras. They'd find a special Japanese maple that had just perfect color, and they would take photos of it and then drive on to find another one. It was pretty neat, but it's no different than people driving up to New England to see the fall color, going up along the Blue Ridge Parkway here in the eastern U.S. One of the things that makes Japanese maples so great is that they tend to be really good four-season plants. If they're pruned well and grown, you can see that they can have just these beautiful structures so that even when the leaves are gone, you still have this beautiful form that's out there. And that's true whether you have a more upright tree growing form or more of a, the weeping cut leaf types, the dissectum types as they're known. And they're great for lighting up. I had to put this picture in here where the plans are ramping up for Moonlight in the Garden again this November. So our partner with Southern Lights of Raleigh, John Garner, he loves getting in there and lighting up the Japanese maples. He'll come through and he'll say, "Do you think this will still have leaves?" And I'll say, we're 2 months away. I'm like, "John, I don't know. If we get a frost, we might lose all the leaves, but otherwise we might have them." So he comes in with a couple different plans on how he's going to light up these Japanese maples. So I'm just going to go through and talk about them. When I originally planned this talk, my thought was I was going to talk about all the different groups and types, because there are some ways that these are grouped by Japanese maple collectors. Broadly speaking, there's the palmatum types that have broad leaves. There are the dissectum types with the really finely cut leaves, Matsumura types and linear lobum types and things like that. But really, as things have in recent years, a lot of these boundaries have been kind of blurred. And so I just decided to pick some of my favorite ones to talk about. And after doing that, I was going through it today before this talk and realizing that this kind of highlighted for me some of what I didn't realize were not my favorite ones. So there are some conspicuous absences in terms of types as we go through this. So what can I say? And they're just in alphabetical order just because it got too difficult to group them together. So this is Aka Shigetatsu Sawa. There's another form called Shigetatsu Sawa that is very, very similar. The Aka, or sometimes Beni in Japanese denotes red. And so often the young leaves have a flush of pink on them, but they also have these red petioles in the Aka Shigetatsu Sawa. So this is a little slower growing than Shigetatsu Sawa, but it makes a decent sized tree with a broad head. Something that I think is criminally underrated often in Japanese maples and in maples in general is how beautiful the flowers can be and the forming fruits. They can really be showy. This is actually later in the season. The flowers have already gone, but the fruits, the little maple wings, are bright red on Aka Shigetatsu Sawa. And I think paired with these really pale leaves is just spectacular, just gorgeous. These kinds with the kind of pale tissue in between the veins, sometimes called ghost variegation. These often for us in Raleigh need some shade to keep from burning, or at least some afternoon shade. And this is one that kind of really, really benefits from a little bit of shade. Ao Kanzashi, another kind of mid-sized shrubby to small tree type, kind of gets broader and broader as it gets older, but you can see kind of this multi-stem. Now, any of these that are growing like that I show like this growing multi-stems, you can grow as a single trunk plant and prune it into a nice head. We are just because of lack of resources here at the Arboretum, we don't always get to pruning our Japanese maples every winter like we'd like to. We get some in the more most high profile areas, but we've actually got a couple of volunteers, and I'm going to talk about them a little bit more at the end, who've been helping us out with getting some of our Japanese maples pruned and are doing a great job. This Ao Kanzashi is one that's got this kind of thin chartreusey green margin to the leaves. Really beautiful, but then the fall color is spectacular on it. And I like this kind of subtle variegation. And this one's pretty regular in it. It's fairly deeply lobed leaves. So it's got kind of a nice frilly appearance to it. And then this Kunara pygmy, this is one that Kunara is because this is from Australia. This is out of Yamina Rare Plants Nursery in Victoria, Australia. This Kunara pygmy kind of emerges with this bright yellow-green. It's a little dwarf plant, more like a shrub, or makes a great bonsai, great container plant. Greens up some during the summer and then gets really good fall color. And I love these dwarfs, partially because I always run out of room. And I'll say that this one beside it, this is just your typical, this is an unnamed red lace leaf, Dissectum atropurpureum type, like you see with Crimson Queen or one of those. I apparently, and kind of didn't realize this, don't love those plants that much because I did not include any of those really with my favorites, or not much of them. So, learn something new about myself. But I do like these dwarfs. I think they can be really beautiful, especially when pruned up. Now, you'll notice that Kunara pygmy, that's a pretty descriptive name, Kunara from Australia, and then pygmy because it's dwarf. And then you have a lot of Japanese names, both plants from Japan, but also a lot of other, both European and American introducers early on would give these Japanese names. But more and more now, you're seeing names that are a little more fun, I guess, for growers in the the West. So things like Frilly Willy, I'm really liking this plant. It's really growing on me. It's kind of, the leaves are a little bit different. What it seems to be is the most vigorous new growth has kind of these really deeply incised, kind of broader leaves. And then kind of the growth on the older, slower growing will be much longer lobes and more deeply incised. And you do get this real frilly appearance on an upright plant. Now, I haven't grown it for too long, so I'm not sure of ultimate height, but looking at kind of growth rate that is going, I think in 10 years, we're going to have a 10-foot, 12-foot tall plant, maybe 6 feet, 5 or 6 feet wide, which makes it really nice for being able to fit into a smaller space. But you get that reddish peach color, peachy red on the new growth, and then more green. If you plant this in more shade, you lose a lot of the red, even on the new growth, and you lose it all on this older growth that really becomes all green. Geisha gone wild. Geisha is a plant that has this variegation. So this is it in the spring. It comes out, and what it is it's basically pretty much creamy white around a green center, but in spring, it's all overlaid with pink, and also all the new growth. And here you can see some new growth that's still doing that. But during the summer, you lose that much to that pink, and it becomes more of a creamy white with a little bit of pink to it and with a green center. Now, geisha is a really compact plant. So geisha gone wild is one that has the appearance of geisha, but it grows much larger, more upright. It's becoming a fairly large plant at the Arboretum. So, but seems to really want to be upright. We're not getting a lot of wide spreading growth on it. It'll be interesting to watch it over, another 5 years and see if it starts to spread, because that's often what they do. But I haven't actually witnessed that myself. I do like it, and it's a funny name at least. There's so many of these Japanese maples that, something really has to stand out about them. And sometimes that's the name as much as anything else. Glowing Embers, another one where the name is descriptive. This is an upright growing plant, kind of really, I find it very different than the typical green leaf upright Japanese maple, in that it's got fairly deeply incised in the longer lobes on the leaves, and they're pretty large leaves. So it gives a very graceful appearance when it's in growth. Omurayama is one that has a kind of a similar growth habit, in that it's up, but then the tips weep over a bit. So it has a very graceful appearance. This is one that you don't want to do. You want to do some pruning to thin it out and clean it up, but you want to accentuate that kind of arching habit, not try and keep it into a nice tight head. The cultivar named Glowing Embers is from the fall color, and unfortunately I don't have a good picture of the fall color, but you get these really bright, hot oranges and reds in the fall color, which is very, very effective. Goshiki Kotohime. Often when you see Goshiki and Kotohime, Goshiki often refers to variegation, as does Nishiki or Nishiki. Kotohime, there is a Kotohime that's a dwarf plant like this, but this is a variegated form of that. So this is a really compact grower. New growth comes out red, but all the growth is very, very congested, very, very congested. And it has the tiniest little flecks of variegation on there. And it'll range from a lot of these little specks on the leaves to almost none, but it's really something that you have to observe up close. This is one that is kind of hard to come by a lot of times because it is so hard to graft. You have to get a little piece like this, to really graft on it. It doesn't graft well from thicker wood. And so it's something that a lot of grafters just don't like to mess with because it's so hard. But I'm going to show several dwarf forms, and this one's quite different. Many of them have a larger leaf and have a fuller appearance, whereas Goshiki Kotohime, as well as Kotohime, have this more stubby look to them, and you can kind of really see the structure of it. And, it's pretty obvious why this would make a good bonsai specimen or a good container specimen. Green Hornet. So I love looking at these dissected leaf Japanese maples, but I don't grow many of them myself personally. This one, to be honest with you, I probably couldn't pick it out from quite a few different ones. I don't know why it was selected, but I do like this one, and it does get very good fall color. So I like that about it. Some of the green lace leaf types tend to burn a little bit more in dry spots, and this sits in a pretty dry area and doesn't seem to burn it, and so you get that really good fall color. If you get a lot of leaf burn on it, then when it starts to go orange, there's a lot of brown in there too. But it's a really nice one, and you can see where with some selective pruning in here, you can really show off that form even during the summer, which I think is nice to be able to see that scaffold a little bit in there. Hanamatoi, this is a really highly prized Japanese maple, very slow growing, dissect leaf. There aren't a lot of variegated dissectums like this, but this one is, the new growth especially comes out just screaming hot pink. There is almost nothing in the garden that'll compete with this, not even flowers when it comes out. As the season progresses, you have the darker burgundy, which kind of fades a bit to green, and the The pink goes more towards white, but it really is kind of this tie-dye kaleidoscope all season long. Gorgeous, gorgeous thing. Maybe if you forced me to tell you what was my favorite Japanese maple, it would probably be a toss-up between Higasayama and Mikawa Yatsubusa. Higasayama, this is it in the fall, which is nice, but oh my, I got my things backwards. This is it in the spring. It comes out and it's got a little bit of a pink on that variegated. I'm gonna have to come back and show you a picture of Higasayama because we're missing it, but you can see that foliage right there. That's the kind of mid to late spring, and if it's sighted right, on through summer foliage. Apparently, I have my PowerPoint, don't have my animations on correctly. It's covered up, but this is a real 4-season plant. And it starts off pretty slow, and then it does this. One thing that gets people frustrated with Higasayama is if it's pushed in growth or sometimes just really growing vigorously, it'll put out a long shoot that will be just solid green. It won't have any of this coloration. The thing is, people think that's a true reversion, and they prune that out. But if you don't prune it out and you leave it, or you prune it to where you would want to, but don't prune it all back, the growth off of that really vigorous growth will go back to this. So it's not a true reversion in that it reverts. It just, it vigorous growth. You don't get the white and green on there. Hogyoku, this is one that I don't personally have. I actually don't own many Japanese maples at home, even though I love them. Because when I first got into horticulture, my plan was to open a Japanese maple nursery. But this is one that's on my own personal list to get. Hogyoku is an upright green leaf Japanese maple, but it is specifically selected and known for its just rich orange fall color. It is just absolutely reliable in having this fantastic, really beautiful orange fall color. And you can imagine that in green at other times of the year, but that orange is just amazing. Jerre Schwartz Broom, kind of an interesting one in that it's almost like a dissectum leaf, but not quite, on this upright growing plant, kind of slow and upright grow. And I think ultimately it can get to be a pretty good size, but it's slow getting there, and you can really keep this smaller and really play with that form as a young plant. It's a good one for, while it isn't like the deep, rich burgundy, it holds what burgundy color it has pretty well through the season. It will green up some, but it holds it fairly well, even in shade, which a lot of them don't. Kagiri Nishiki, this, and there's another one, have been distributed in the U.S. under the names Roseo marginatum. They shouldn't have been, but they have been. Kagiri Nishiki is a really nice upright plant, fairly vigorous. It's a little like butterfly, which is a little more common, but this isn't quite as, this is, in my mind, a little more graceful than butterfly. It often has these kind of distorted shaped leaves or sickle shaped leaf. A lot of these variegated Japanese maples like this, the really good variegation is on the newest growth. And as the trees age and get bigger, you lose some of that with the new growth. And it's really by keeping them pruned regularly and not allowing them to get enormous that you could really get the most color from them in the spring when they emerge like this. Kagiri Nishiki is another little dwarf lace leaf. The leaves are not quite as fine as on some other dissectums and a little bit more irregular, but I do like it, and I really love the fall color. Seems to always get this kind of these little hints of bright yellow in with the reds and burgundies on there. So it almost looks like it's on fire. And I think that you'll get this sometimes in some other Japanese maples, but you get it every year on the Kagiri Nishiki. And then this is kind of a classic Japanese cultivar, Kiyohime. This is in our Japanese garden. It's this low, broad spreading dwarf. There are quite a few dwarves, but this is one that, rarely gets much more than 24, 30 inches tall. It can get taller, and ours is actually taller now. It's been in the garden for quite some time. But unlike a lot of the other dwarfs, this really will branch and grow out to the side. It seems to have this aversion to going straight up, but you can see some of these branches, if that were standing up, it'd be, 10 feet tall, but it comes out and it goes over, and that's just the way it wants to grow. It's like it doesn't want to get up higher. And it's beautiful every season. It's, during the winter, especially after we've had some pruning done on that. But this is it in the spring. It comes out with kind of red, this vibrant red tinge to it. Opens up, becomes kind of a green over the season. Just amazing plant. I've seen it in, everywhere, the National Arboretum, all kinds of places where it's just beautiful. What would be beautiful, really even better, was if we had a big boulder and this was kind of coming up, growing over that boulder and just melding into it. Really just gorgeous plant. And it'll actually get there without taking too long. Kochi no Mai, this is a good variegated form. I haven't grown this really outdoors for very long. This is it in a container. It's got this great creamy white, even in spring, kind of yellowy white, becomes more white as the season progresses. And the green there, I think it's a beautiful little plant. I'm waiting to see how it develops, but sometimes these new things are a favorite and they become less favorites if they're not good growers. Koto Ito Komachi, despite the name, this is one I believe that was developed in the UK, I think, maybe in the US. But it's real fine foliage, no serrations on the leaf, just these, this almost looks like a little arching bamboo to me. I think this texturally is just so striking. And then the fall color is amazing as well. I just love the little thing. Ito Komachi. And Mama Fu, this is another one that's fairly new for me. So there's an old cultivar called Mama from Japan. And Mama means something is like, you say that to somebody who kind of does whatever they want, doesn't really take direction well. I don't know if there's a real easy translation. But Mama gets that name because because the leaves are all like this. It's not variegated, it's green, but each leaf kind of does its own thing. Each lobe on the leaf kind of does its own thing, they grow all kinds of different ways. Mama Fu is a variegated form of Mama. So some people I know hate the plants like this with the leaves are all different. But what I like about that is from a little bit of a difference, it gives a much different texture to the plant. It's very almost fluffy, like as the plant ages. They kind of looks like tufts of kind of variegated foliage on there, which I think is pretty cool. Mardi Gras, another really kind of interesting plant to me. I like this because the name, my family's from New Orleans, so anything that's Mardi Gras I like. But in my experience with this plant, it's been kind of a low, broad spreading tree every time you've grown it. It's a green leaf form, nice green stems as well. I like the forms with green stems. It's almost always has 7 lobes. Sometimes you'll see Japanese maples with 5 lobes. But when you have these 7 lobes, it gives kind of a different texture to the leaves, the way they're held. They kind of, instead of being kind of flat, they are kind of held perpendicular to the ground often. And what happens is you get this really vivid display with good fall color when the leaves are held like that. It's one that probably needs more work than a lot of the ones I'm talking about in terms of pruning to really get a beautiful tree. And you can see this is not one that's been beautifully pruned. You got these kind of flyaways in there. But when it is kind of cleaned up and given some TLC, it's really, really beautiful. Now, I mentioned with Higasayama that Perhaps my other favorite, the two favorites were Higasayama and Mikawa Yatsubusa. Mikawa Yatsubusa is another classic dwarf. Yatsubusa denotes a dwarf when you're talking about Japanese maples. And it's often described as the leaves are kind of layered like roof tiles. And I guess that's true. I don't know. It's got very congested growth. It's got these pretty broad leaflets on there that kind of midway divided. But it definitely has a very distinct look to it. This is right outside our visitor center here. And the plant just gets better and better every year. And apparently every year when it's in fall color, it's in beautiful color and it gets yellows and burgundies and reds and oranges in there. I must just stop and gawk at it and then not take a picture because I have no good pictures of it in fall color, but it's beautiful every year. This is one of the few I do have my house. I grow this in a container in front of my house and it just always looks good. And it's in full blazing sun. I'm terrible about watering things and it does well for me. Milky Way. I remember when I first saw a picture of this, this is one of the newer ones that said, put us on the list we need this at the Arboretum. Gorgeous pink young stems. That's something that I hadn't seen before on many Japanese maples with these really hot pink stems. And I tend not to grow a lot of Japanese maples personally for stem color. There's some great red stem, coral bark Japanese maples. I don't grow those. There's some really nice gold ones like Gold Digger and Bihu. But the combination of these young stems with these heavily variegated leaves, I just really thought was beautiful. And this is a plant that definitely, if I was growing it, I would be pruning it very, very regularly in order to encourage some good growth each year without it getting too big, because as stems get older on these colorful stemmed plants, they tend to lose that color. So, when you get real big, they lose the contrast between these variegated leaves and those pink stems. Murasagi, I also apparently don't love upright red leaf Japanese maples because this is maybe the only one that I have in here. Murasagi always has a beautiful form, always has good burgundy color that really lasts through most of the summer, even into the real heat of the summer. And then it gets a real clean fall color as well. The name, I forget the name, means something like wet heron or something. I don't translate a lot of these names, and a lot of them people say, well, what does this Japanese name mean? And a lot of times it's hard to translate because sometimes they're named for a person or some small, a little stream or village or something like that, or sometimes the name is kind of the meaning is lost. They're not always a direct translation of all these names, but some there are. Well, this is one that does. Ojishi, this, you see the kind of the frilled leaves, real compact grower. This is in Japan. One of the most popular Japanese maples is Shishi Gashira, which is called the lion's mane Japanese maple, which has this kind of congested green growth on it. In Japan, they really separate Shishi Gashira into two types. There's Ojishi, which is male lions, and there's Meijishi, which is the female lions. And what we grow is Shishi Gashira. In Japan, they would mostly call that Meijishi, the female line, which is a larger growing one. So Ojishi is a even more compact Shishi Gashira, is how that works. So you get really good fall color. And on both Ojishi and Shishi Gashira, the fall color tends to really last late in the season. This is often one of the last ones showing really good color, this and Shishi Gashira. Beautiful plant. I mentioned with Hogyoku that it is really known for its intense orange fall color. Osakazuki is known for its really intense red fall color. It's very clean, true red fall color. So, some Japanese maples vary from year to year a bit. Others have really, you can just always rely on, exactly which color you're going to get. And Sakazuki is one that is got that great fall color. It's a green leaf one with very large leaves for a Japanese maple. But the other thing I love about it, this is it in flower, going from flower to fruit. Yeah, it looks like it's starting to go to fruit. And I think this is another one that is really underrated for how showy it is in both flower and fruit against that green foliage, that bright red. And you'll get more of those flowers if you grow it in more sun as well. I think it's really underrated. Put these two together. I like them both. I have had trouble keeping Koyuki really happy. It really needs some shade. Peaches and Cream is kind of similar to that first one I showed, the Akashigetatsu Sawa, where you have the pink flushed white interveinal tissue and then the green veins on there. This definitely needs some shade during the heat of our summers and probably doesn't want to be too dry. Typically, Japanese maples will grow almost anywhere that there is, as long as there isn't standing water. But in really dry spots, they can suffer if they're not getting some extra summer moisture. That is after they're established. You got to get them established first. But really, we want to figure out how to grow this because I love the leaf margins on this. They're really super serrate leaf margins. I think are just beautiful on Koyuki. And some things I didn't see, seem to be newer things. I've never seen this in any of the old collections in Japan where you had the curved over leaves. This is Peve Starfish from Europe. And I just love the way this plant looks out in the garden with the margins all rolled over. There's another one where the margins all rolled out called Okujimi. I can't remember, that I like as well, but I just love the way this looks. And you can see here, this is how it emerges, this really dark color, and then it lightens up a bit. This is one of the few plants where I like it even more after it lightens up over the summer. It's something about that look is just tremendously, while you can't tell from this leaf, it's just so different from other Japanese maples. So far, this has been a very slow grower for us, so I don't know what its ultimate size will be, but it seems like it's going to be kind of a mid-size, shrubbier plant. A nice little dwarf Rhode Island red. This is my very favorite dwarf Yatsubusa type, dwarf kind of the broader leaf type. Just makes a great little shrub, makes a great little bonsai. Just fantastic. Really looks good with some good sun. It greens up a little bit more in the shade. And Ryusin, this picture on the left is actually my house. I took that, it looks like maybe 2 years ago. It still looks like that, kind of cascading around. It merges very pale green, which I love against the blue pot. In fall, you get great fall color. This is one of those ones that seeing the original plant was a real revelation for me for what it could look like. Ryusin was kind of a breakthrough. This is one of the first really true weeping forms that didn't have dissected leaves, had the typical Acer palmatum leaf. So it was quite different from everything else. And they've been growing it here. This is Kobayashi Momijin in Saitama growing it. And I loved how they were growing their weeping trees. These are all Ryusin, but they were growing other ones like this as well. And I've tried to convince American nurserymen to do this. They have these pots, and you can see the latches on them. They grow them and graft them, right side up, but then they plant them in these upside down pots and let gravity do its thing. And then when they get bigger, they'll open these latches, and they're on hinges. And so they can just open this pot up and they can plant it right side up, and then it can start weeping down. And what this does is it gives a very natural shape to the stem. In the US, it seems like usually with the weeping plants, you either get it grafted up high, so you got a straight stem and then it's grafted up high, or it's grafted low and then it is staked just perfectly straight up, and then it's allowed to cascade over. Or sometimes it's serpentined, that may do a serpentine back and forth, which I think is one of the all-time ugly, terrible things that they do, that nurserymen do to plants. But hey, if you like it, you like it. That's, to each their own. But this, you get a plant that is growing straight up, but without the, that real rigid. So when you turn it over and grow it, there's a fluid sinuosity to it that seems natural. And really, I'd like to try this with other things like our weeping red buds and, pretty much any weeping woody plant. I'd love to try growing like this in our nursery here. And hopefully we'll make this an intern project to get them to make us put hinges on a bunch of pots for us. Ryugu, with Japanese maples, I tend not to like the speckled variegation as much on it as some other ones. I do on this Ryugu, and I also like this plant because it keeps me humble. I had a fairly large plant. I usually don't buy big plants, but my wife wanted me to bid on a large Ryugu at an auction, and I did, and I won it, paid more money than I would have for it otherwise, and planted it. And it is one of the only Japanese maples that I've killed in my home garden that wasn't destroyed by my dogs, but actually I just killed it because I didn't take good enough care of it. So it keeps me humble. But this is a very slow growing shrubby form, and it's quite attractive as a young plant. Now, this one, Kagiri Nishiki, see, it has just a little bit of a yellow edge to the leaf, very kind of understated. But when you back up from the plant, when it comes out in the spring and even summer, has this almost gold look, kind of a dense, shrubby growing plant, kind of a different growth habit than a lot of other ones. And I think it's just beautiful. And then whenever you have a Japanese maple with a margin like this or lighter color, you always know that fall color, you're going to get really bright tints. You'll get deeper, richer tints with where the dark greens are, but then brighter where the light color is. And that's the same with this. Seiho is kind of just interesting. It's got very small leaves, kind of rounded, blunt, or misshapen lobe tips on there. It's a different plant, really probably needs some really good pruning, but in a container and pruned, it's gorgeous. Now, this is a plant that I always call Seiryu, but it's probably Seiryu, because Ryu means dragon and Sei is kind of blue-green. And this was really the first, I mentioned that Ryusen was the first weeping palmatum type leaf plant. Seiryu is really the first upright dissected leaf, or one of the first ones. It's a very old one. And so it comes out and it's a green leaf one. There's some red leaf ones now, but you get that fine color and fine texture with that dissect leaf on an upright plant, which is pretty cool. Shishi Yatsubusa, much like Mikawa Yatsubusa, except for the leaves tend to be longer with longer lobes, less of a squat star and more of a long pointed star. So it gives a different appearance. It also tends to grow these, I don't know what you would call it, these side branches that kind of grow irregularly. It's quicker growing than Mikawa Yatsubusa for sure. But so if you want that look, but you want it in a bigger plant, this is definitely one that I think you place it where you really want a focal point and prune it into a real sculptural plant. Some are gold. Here it is in our lath house. Hard to get a great picture in the lath house, but this is kind of early summer. It's still gold. This is it when it's in flowers. The flowers really show up well against that chartreusey yellow foliage. Newest growth is really yellow with a pink tinge. I really like that. And then great fall coloring. Sayuka, another upright green one. Apparently, I really like these upright green leaf ones. What I like about this is one where the bark really stays green on it. Not all of them do. A lot of them will go brown. By the time they get to be an inch or so, they've really gone brown. You can see these are some pretty thick stems. So it really looks green like this, but when the fall color comes and you get this really intense fall color, it really highlights these green stems. And I think that's hard to beat that in my mind. Via Toronto, found in Italy, has these really long lobes. I mean, this thing is so deeply dissected, and it tends to have that reddish kind of overlay to the leaves. The more shade it gets, the less red it gets at all. It'll be just solid green if you get it in really dense shade. And Wu Nishiki, just a beautiful, beautiful plant. This is it during the spring. This is it during the fall. You see, you got a little bit of dry in the early fall, so it didn't color up as well as it could have, but another really beautiful one with little variegation on there. But it's one that, like, our plant is big, hasn't been pruned. It really, you lose some of that variegation, but you go in there and prune it again, and then next year you'll get that you get more of that variegation again. And then Yubei, another upright red, kind of wide-spreading red that I think is really very nice. But, I said my two favorite cultivars. If I had to pick one Japanese maple to grow, it would just be the wild species, the green leaf Japanese maple. If you give them enough time and some age and allow them to grow up, they just create a beautiful form. They always have spectacular fall color. I hear people complaining about, can't grow sugar maples here. If you grow seedling Japanese maples, just green leaf seedling Japanese maples, you will have fantastic fall color. Guaranteed, always. They're just so good. I have kind of a wooded area, and, my plan is in parts of it just to sprinkle some of these in there and let them grow to 25 or 30 feet tall and wide and get different oranges and reds and purples in there with the fall color. I think it's so hard to beat. So if that whet your appetite for maples, I'm going to put a plug in for the Maple Society. Maple Society is a great group. It's a very active society. Go to maplesociety.org. There's the International Symposium is going to be here in Raleigh in October of 2022. You should put on your calendar to be here for it. I know whenever I go to Maple Society meetings, I always see friends from here in the Raleigh area in the Southeast. And when I go other places, it's just a very good group of people, really welcoming, really very knowledgeable. The society is made up of folks from botanic gardens, from Japanese maple or maple specialist nurseries, and then homeowners and enthusiasts and plant lovers. And they really do come from all over the world for the International Symposium. There is a move afoot by the Maple Society board, I understand, to develop regional groups. And so Jim and Lynn Swanson, who are volunteers here at the Arboretum, they're the couple who have been helping us with pruning our Japanese maples. They are avid maple collectors and lovers, have a gorgeous garden full of Japanese maples. They are spearheading the Southeast group. They're going to see if there's an interest in that. I believe they're going to get together in fall 2021. Jim gave me his email, but it looks like it may be misspelled with 2 L's on there, or else maybe he doesn't really want anybody to get him an email. But Jim, I don't know if you're on here, but you're welcome to unmute yourself if you would have anything you'd like to add to that. Stop my share. See if I may have been saying so many things he didn't agree with that he got off of here.
I was just looking for Jim and I didn't see him.
Okay, he's probably out in the garden gardening.
But my window collapsed when you did that. I was going to see if Lynn was in here.
I know Lynn wasn't. So stay tuned for that. We'll send out information on that. That is something that we definitely, as maple lovers, we want to support their efforts on that. I mentioned some problems with maples. I want to talk about that a little bit first, talk a little bit about pruning as well and resources. First one issue that people often come to me with is they say, I've got little spots all over the leaves on my plant. And that can be from there are a few different things that will cause that. One, there are some fungal diseases that can cause leaf spotting. A lot of that times that has to do with if we get a lot of rain during the spring when the newly emerging leaves, it can either be a fungus that can grow on there, or it can be if you get raindrops on there, especially early when the leaves are tender, and then we get a really bright sunny day, the leaves just act like magnifying glasses and will actually burn holes and like burn spots in there. There's also some fungal things. The problem with that, with whatever happens to them when that happens, is once those spots are there, they're there. So even if it was caused by a fungus, generally there's nothing you can do at that point. If you're spraying a fungicide, the horse is already out of the barn, it's already bolted, so there's no real sense in it. What you should do though, if you see that, is in the fall when the leaves do fall, go ahead and rake them up and get rid of them. Send them to be composted, throw them in the trash, whatever, and don't leave them under your Japanese maple, because that just provides the spores can overwinter there. So if you're seeing that on your maple leaves, just practice some good garden hygiene. Something that somebody sent us a note about before this program was about Japanese maple scale. This is a problem that's becoming worse, but it's been on the East Coast since the early 1900s. And the name's a bit of a misnomer because they don't just attack Japanese maples. The scale attacks a really wide variety of plant material. Problem with Japanese maple scale is they're very small and they really blend in with bark on plants. So it can be very hard to see. It is a waxy scale, so it has a waxy covering, so it's very hard to kill as well. You can go online and find some chemical things. I don't spray pesticides much at all. Oh, I don't spray them at all in my home garden. We don't really do it much at all here. They're difficult. Japanese maple scale are difficult to kill. You can spray dormant oil while your plant is dormant to smother them, but really you need to get them when they're emerging, which is the crawlers, the young are emerging because the eggs sit under the protective coating of the parent. So you can spray with an oil. Really, when the first round of crawlers are going, is you can time it to when oak leaf hydrangea, that's not neem oil, it's something different. Dormant oil is not neem oil. You can time it for when the oak leaf hydrangeas start flowering. That's usually right around the same time as the crawlers are emerging. But here in the South, there's a second generation of crawlers later in the summer. So it's hard. It's hard to get the horticultural oil, not dormant oil, but during growing season, you use horticultural oil, which is not quite as effective. But if you can keep the numbers down, you don't have to worry about eradicating it. But it is something that if you have it, you're going to have to treat it multiple times. Now, one of the nice things about it, I guess, is a lot of scale, when they feed on the phloem, which is where the nutrients are going through the plant. And so they suck up a lot of material and then they poop it out, and you get sooty mold growing on that's called honeydew, the sweet material they secrete. And that's one way to tell you have scale, is if you see that black sooty mold growing on plants or the ground underneath there, that's usually a sign that you have scale. The type of scale that is on the Japanese maple scale, this type of scale actually sucks the fluid out of the cells themselves. So it causes the cells to collapse, but they don't suck up such a big volume. So you don't get that sooty mold. So it's harder to tell they're there, but it's also, they have less kind of secondary damage than other scales. So my recommendation, what I would do if I had an infestation at my house, is I would spray a dormant oil over the winter and try and smother as much of it as I could. If it was a really bad infestation, when my oak leaf hydrangeas started flowering, I would go in there and I would really spray down the stems, especially the other undersides, with a horticultural oil, which is a little bit lighter than a dormant oil. And that's probably all I would do. That would keep the numbers in check. And probably I'd have to do that every couple of years, but that can be effective. Pruning, I've mentioned that several times. Your best bet is to take a good pruning class. But with maples, you want to prune to right at where the node is, prune right above that, or prune to the branch collar, kind of where it swells and you leave off, and the new branch comes off. We do some classes on how to prune, so you can do that. But what you always want to do with any pruning is first you look for dead, diseased branches, then crossing branches where they're going to rub against each other. Prune out things that are, if you have your plant like this, and sometimes you have a branch that's going back through your, from your plant, you want to prune those out. And then just step back and look at the plant. Think of pruning as a meditation. Don't rush it. Stand back. You can never put that branch back on. So stand back and look at it. There are some real techniques to how you prune if you really want to get into it. But both basically, you want to look at the plant and whatever's going to make the nicest shape for you. I like to accentuate a very natural shape. But I was just visiting my father-in-law, and his next door neighbor had a Kusa dogwood that he had pruned into this perfectly kind of gumdrop shape, and it was just coming into flower, and it was beautiful. I mean, it was just so well pruned, not sheared, but pruned. It was gorgeous. I should have taken a picture. I did not. But that's something that if we have enough interest in, and we form this regional maple group, I'm certain that we would probably like to, we co-sponsor some maple pruning classes and demonstrations and really have people learn how to do it. But it's one of those things that we can teach you how to do it in 10 minutes. You can be pretty good at it in, 10 hours, and you can still be learning more in 10 years. And that's the beauty of a lot of horticulture, is that it can be a lifelong process of how to do it. Yeah, somebody there just talked about, do you have questions? Deer eating the new foliage of the cut leaf types and it grows back with contrasting new growth to. Yeah, deer can be a problem. Just plant a lot of, hosta and other things that they like more.
There were a whole lot of questions about sun requirements, Mark. I think some of those people may have missed it in the beginning.
Let me go back just because I was talking about pruning, and I see a question here about time of year for pruning. Generally, with Japanese maples, you prune January, February. That's when you can see the plant. It's a good time for it with Japanese maples. Don't wait too late, or else you get the sap running in there and it can be messy. So if you don't get it January, February, you can do it during the summer. But really, the shape and the bark and the trunk of your Japanese maple can be as beautiful as it can be with leaves on it. So really, you want to be able to see that form. So sun. So Japanese maples are, I mentioned this at the beginning, Japanese maples are understory trees. That's where they grow in the wild. They do grow wild. They're not just, all these crazy cultivars. So they naturally like a little bit of shade. They can grow in full sun, but you will have, with the real dissected leaf types, you'll tend to have more issues with leaf burn if they're in full sun and it gets really dry. Roots on maples are very shallow, so you want to mulch them well. And while an established Japanese maple will survive a drought just fine in full sun, you will get some dieback and it'll look crispy. So I like to keep the real cut leaf ones out of full afternoon sun unless they're going to be somewhere where I'm going to water them. The ones that tend to have the leaflets have the most serrations on them tend to, those are little areas that can dry out. So tend to see more of that. But if you come out here and walk around the Arboretum, we've got, I don't know how many Japanese maples. I should have looked that up, but a lot of them are in full sun, and you can kind of see how they're doing. We've got our big Japanese maple in the middle of a brick turnaround, reflected heat and light on all sides. It has to be 100-year drought for us to put water on the thing, and it does just fine. Any way to ID old Japanese maples in the backyard? Yes, no. You can send pictures to me or to, even better, Matt and Tim Nichols up at mrmaple.com. I tend to be pretty conservative when I'm trying to name something, and I'm old enough to know that I don't know much. That can be a problem identifying them. A lot of times they're just seedling grown plants, but if you take pictures of the real distinctive characteristics of it, maybe. Somebody says, what about flood prone areas like Crabtree Creek? They can tolerate short bits of flooding. They do not like, that is the one soil they do not like, is wet soils. That is the one thing they don't like. They'll grow in sand, they'll grow in heavy clay, won't necessarily be happy in any of those. They'll die in waterlogged soils.
Health question about her blood good dying a little bit on the tops of the branches.
So some Japanese maples, you get this dying at the tips of the branches, and I forget what causes that, what the disease, there is something that causes that, and I can never remember what it is. You see it a lot with the coral bark Japanese maples. If somebody knows that, let me know. It typically won't kill them. If you thin your tree out and do some pruning, a lot of times that will help it, but I don't know about that. Wind, they're okay with wind, although that can dry them out. Salt wind, they don't like that at all, though. If you want to slow the growth of a Japanese maple, are there any techniques? Well, you can graft it onto a dwarf rootstock. Otherwise, you can prune it to keep it small, but that does not slow the growth. Pruning stimulates growth.
Marty, on the flip side, you can also prune the root systems if it's a containerized plant.
Right.
That'd be kind of a bonsai effect, if you will. Take it out every early spring, repot it after you've repruned it.
Yeah, it says, do the shallow roots demand a wide versus narrow container? No, they're fine in a shallow container, but I grow Japanese maples in tall containers and tall, narrow containers, and they're fine that way.
And they're a great plant for containers.
Mm-hmm.
They don't complain at all. There was a question earlier, Mark, from someone in Zone 9A. Any good recommendations for that far south? She comments that the stores seem to have them, but she never sees them around.
What I would say is go visit public gardens and see what they have growing there. I really don't know which ones are specifically good for really warm areas. I mean, they're growing all over Tokyo. They can get some cold, but it's pretty darn hot there. And I've seen them pretty far south in Japan, but I just don't know about that. Anything else? Well, thank you all. Oh, I did mean to show some resources. Almost forgot that. This, I think, is out of print, but the World Checklist of Maple Cultivar Names. This is not just Japanese maples, but all kinds of maples. This is the first edition, trying to convince the folks at Westonburt to do a second edition, or maybe folks at Mr. Maple. There's the Vertrees Japanese Maple book. This is the third edition. There is a fourth, maybe a fifth edition now. This is great information. There's great information online. Then there's some other just general maple books like Maples for Gardens, Color Encyclopedia, Maples of the World, especially if you're more interested in species and not so much in the cultivars, and an illustrated guide to maples. And there are plenty more than that, of course. Looks like somebody has their hand up. You're welcome to ask a question if you like. Just a reminder that we've got the Southeastern Plant Symposium. We'd love to see you there. And the plant auction, we will have some maples, Japanese maples that are going in there. Somebody asked about fertilizer. If you're growing them in containers, you want to just use a general all-purpose fertilizer. I do it at pretty light recommendations, maybe break it up into 2 applications or do a slow release. If you are growing them in the ground, and depends on where you are. If you have a sandy soil, you may need to add some fertilizer. I have never once in decades of gardening fertilized my plants at home. I just don't do it. I grow in red clay. There's lots of nutrients there. I've never had a plant that had nutrient deficiencies. We've got somebody, Takatsubachi, who's given some great information about bonsai. So there's some potting, in bonsai and container plants, you do need to take your plants out, prune some roots, and repot every couple of years, get some new soil in there. Don't want to do a lot of fertilizer. For bonsai, I usually recommend people use fish emulsion for fertilizing. It's very gentle to plants, stinks a little bit, but it tends to be very good for them. Yeah, somebody put a couple of great spots where you can see great Japanese maple collections. That is for sure. Everybody, if you love Japanese maples, you should make a trip up to Mr. Maple up in the mountains. I don't know if they're open all the time. Maybe they just have certain open weekends, but go to their website and find out. They're a ton of fun. Matt and Tim Nichols, they know so much about Japanese maples. It's amazing.
Ron also mentioned just a moment ago, or a little while ago, that the Maple Society has a virtual meeting tomorrow.
Oh, great. Yeah. So Maple Society has a virtual meeting tomorrow. So go into their website and look at that. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mark.
Hope to see you all bidding on some maples and other things in our auction.
Have a great week, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Yes. And next week, it will be flowering lawns.
Yep.
Remember.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.